Hi everybody, this is Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and it is Tuesday. I have not done a tag for 2 weeks. Quite a bit on my mind and taking up time and just all over the place, so these usually require a little bit of thinking on my part instead of just reading and then giving impressions right away. So I was tagged in the Nut book tag Josh at Literary Gladiators created. I'll link to his video below. He's great because he really goes into why he selected each of these nuts, why the prompts stem from each of these different types of nuts. I use nuts in some of my cooking. I don't drink wine, so I don't do like wine and cheese and nut, like board type situation. But I do enjoy using nuts in various like baked goods and regular food. My chicken mole has an excellent use of nuts to get the right flavor for that. So, without further ado, The Almond, a work that can be equally a staple in a classroom setting and for personal or casual reading. And I think this is the only book that I didn't have a copy of. I would say the poetry of Emily Dickinson. I can remember reading Emily Dickinson, I wouldn't say in grade school, middle school, certainly in middle school, in high school, in AP Language or AP Literature. And she is a poet I continue to return to. She's a poet who has some accessible imagery, some accessible themes, and yet when you really dig in, there's such dense language there. And it's astonishing. I love her poetry. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And that's why it's almost like bizarre that I don't have I think I've never found the right edition that I really like of her poetry. I've always just kind of used library copies or anthologies or online copies of her poems. But I love it to a bizarre degree. Question 2, The Walnut, a 21st century work in translation you feel should be studied. For me, I thought about it. There were a couple of choices, but the one I come back to every time is The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. This is an amazing book. The second one, The Angel's Game, is also very strong. Not as big a fan of the third book, The Prisoner of Heaven, but Shadow of the Wind is a knockout book. The way it was like this, Gabriel Garcia Marquez meets Umberto Eco meets Jorge Luis Borges for a sprawling magic show. That was what the back of it said at the used bookstore, and I grabbed it and saw that and was like, why not? And it turned out to be one of the books I've loved the most in this the past 20 years, and one of the books that I've reread the most, and one that I'm really excited to read like with my kids. My wife and I have read this together, and we just love it. It was originally written in Spanish. I believe it's set in Barcelona, right? And just fantastic work. It has a famous library of forgotten books, I think is what it's called, where it's just these like editions you would never see anywhere else. And it seems like such a cool building, such a cool place. I want there to be one in real life. Question 3, The Peanut, a media-based adaptation you credit for getting people to read. I thought for a long time about Game of Thrones, because I think if you read one of the Song of Ice and Fire novels by George R.R. Martin, they're long enough that you're probably going to then have spent enough time to go and read other books. I don't know that the Harry Potter or Hunger Games films do that. The books are short enough that somebody could just read them and not ever really pick up reading. I think the Game of Thrones show, if you read the Song of Ice and Fire, you're probably, you've built a habit. But I went with another one. I talked for a long time about this question with my wife. This is one of the 3 questions that I spent the most time talking about. We decided on the 1990s Pride and Prejudice BBC production, or maybe it wasn't BBC, maybe it was Granada or something else. It just feels like so many people reference that, and then went and read Pride and Prejudice, which isn't long. I think it's only 300 pages, 350 pages, but it's long enough and it's dense enough that if you've read that, you're probably going to be able to keep reading. And it's a very funny book. It's a funny enough book that somebody might use it as a gateway to other 19th century novels, other novels by female writers, other sort of like classics, post-Renaissance classics novels, and read those. Question 4, Cashew, a good writer with an aggressively straightforward tone. Runner-up was Plato. Winner is Dante. Dante has a tone. Dante's tone He's got a laundry list of everybody who wronged him, and they're all in hell. And everybody who sort of wronged him, and or who's struggling, you're in purgatory with them. And then that handful of people he really respects, you got to go to paradise. But that's not at all the way Dante is. There are absolutely personal grudges throughout the Divine Comedy, but his tone is just, it's a tonic. And in the right translation, I love the Lawrence Binion translation. In the right translation, you can see how deep his mind is, but you can also see the personality sings through. There's definitely some flavor to what Dante writes. Question 5, The Hazelnut, a sweet work with rich description. I chose Some Prefer Nettles by Junichiro Tanizaki. This is set at the end of the Japanese Empire, so it's in the 1920s, and it deals sort of with different generations. It deals with a character who has a young mistress. This older character has a young mistress, but he loves going to the old school puppet theaters. And the description of 1920s Tokyo is incredible. The description of the puppet theaters, of all of the different aspects of the culture, are really just phenomenal, without ever feeling like they're a catalog. And so I highly recommend this. It's a Japanese novel. If you've never read like 20th century Japanese novels or anything other than Asian novels outside of Haruki Murakami, this might be a good gateway book. And it's just beautiful. Question 6, Pistachio, an accessible biblical reference or story in a given work. There are so many. I wanted to have one that was humorous, so I go with The Miller's Tale within Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where there is a character who has the vision that the great flood is coming. It's going to be twice as bad as Noah's flood. Let's all build wooden wash tubs and hang them from our ceilings, and then we can go wait in those, and we'll be okay when the flood comes. And there's a lot going on in The Miller's Tale. Certainly the most transgressive story I read in high school. in high school, like in the schoolroom. Question 7, The Pecan, a work that gives you a sense of the American South. Faulkner felt too easy. I'm not a huge fan of Huckleberry Finn, it was hard to pick one, but I ended up going with Peter Matheson's Shadow Country, which is a much more recent book. I think this was 2009, 2010, maybe 2008. It's a mammoth of a book, but it's a really, really incredible book. It looks at Florida, and I want to say it's like the Everglades, and a guy who was a famous sugarcane planter, like in real life, E.J. Watson. And then it's sort of like the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, deals with African American characters. It deals with, and one of the most important things I think it deals with is the idea that there were and are, but there were at that time, there were people in the South who were the product of white men assaulting African American women. Some of them who were slaves, or some of them who had been slaves, and just this idea that African Americans were essentially like plunder for whites, even after the Civil War in many areas of the South. And what that means when you have a cousin or a brother who is the product of that type of assault, and what that means, and there are characters who deal with the victory in the Civil War of the North, but then the Pyrrhic victory that is Reconstruction, and what that means. And so I really feel Shadow Country deals with all those in some really incredible ways, and also deals just with the nature and how unique the wilderness can be that still exists within the South. Question 8, The Brazil Nut, a work that brings about a controversy in a country. This was semi-controversial. It's Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice. So it's written in the 1960s, and I believe it's 1960s, not 1970s. Eldridge Cleaver at one point called himself the Minister of Information of the Black Panthers. It's primarily a series of essays he wrote while he was in prison, or I think while he was still in prison, or just as he was coming out of prison. It's a very powerful book. He says he has a higher uneducation, and there are aspects of this that are incredibly unpleasant to read, not just because of the realities of the prison system, but some of the things Cleaver says as he indicts what's happening in the prison system, and as he indicts what's happening in urban areas where no the social structure is not allowing or is not setting anyone up for success. He also has some like bold and virulent things to say about people like James Baldwin that, reading it now, it creates its own separate controversy now. It's a powerful book. I don't agree with everything that's in it, but it certainly is controversial. The number 9, The Pine Nut, a small but important work. I went with Death in the Compass by Jorge Luis Borges, so one of his short stories. It's a very short story. It deals with a mystery where there's a detective who's tracking a master criminal and realizes there's a certain geometric structure that the murders are creating, and he's going to catch this person. And as with every story that Borges wrote, there's so much underneath it. There's so much symbolism. It's an incredible short story. It's probably the one of Borges's that sticks to me the most as a story I can give somebody to read. Kind of like Shadow of the Wind, where I feel like I can give the person that story to read, and it will unlock just what happens within Borges' writings, how magical they are. It might not be my favorite story of his, but it's one that I feel is a gateway to reading that type of like labyrinthine, elliptical, just beautiful short stories. Question 10, The Macadamia Nut, a dense, wordy, and sometimes difficult work. Anything by William Blake? I would go with Milton, in part because it's one of his. It's kind of in the middle of. You have his, Songs of Innocence and Experience. On the far side, you have Jerusalem or the Four Zoas, where, holy cow, Milton kind of fits in between. There's enough intertextuality going on that if you've read enough, you have some like places, some places in the rock face to climb and clamber up. So anything by William Blake, but I would go with Milton. I think that's a good sort of like intermediate Blake work. Prompt 11, The Chestnut, the perfect winter read. So I will go with Snow Country by Yasunari Kawabata. Very slim book. I don't speak any or read any language from Asia, but my understanding of Kawabata's writing is that, and to me this was part of why I wanted to read it, is his writing in a sense is if somebody took haiku and tried to write sentence after sentence in a haiku rhythm as a prose work, and just capture that type of like rhythm and meter, and the story itself is quite incredible. It's again an older character. He's a wealthy sophisticate, and he meets a geisha, and there's some different aspects of Japan it gets through. It was published, I believe, in the 1940s or 1950s. Kawabata famously did win a Nobel Prize for Literature. I think he was the first like East Asian individual to win a Nobel Prize for Literature, or the first after World War II, something like that. But it's an incredible book. All of Kawabata's writings are incredible. I think this is his best. Sometimes it's worrisome to start with the best book by somebody because you feel like you're just going to go downhill from there. But this is such a beautiful book and such an interesting book, and the way it captures the interactions between people in a way that very few writers can, and intersperses that with just a sense of place and a sense of place, not just like human constructions of place, but place within natural constructions of place and nature and where on earth we are. Question 12, The Acorn. What kind of works are you hoarding or binge reading right now? Well, now that it is April, it's National Poetry Month, so I've got a whole section that I'm working through this month. Many of these I had already started. The French poetry really of the 19th and early 20th century. I've been reading this on and off for a few months. George Herbert and 17th century religious poets. I've been working through these. I just finished Poems of the Late An yesterday. Christina Rossetti's poetry, and then later this month I plan to read Ovid's Metamorphoses. So that's really what's on my plate. The final question: what is your favorite nut? Smoked pecans in butter and salt. So when I smoke like meat or something, as we get towards the end, I'll take out a tray of pecans with some melted butter and salt uh, that I've rolled them in. I just throw them on the smoker for, you know, 15 to 20 minutes. Sometimes I'll do like 2 trays of that and bring them in, and they're delicious. So the peanut gallery hootie tag, anybody who feels up for it. This is a fun one. There's a lot of great questions. So thank you, BookTube. I'll be back around. So hope you're all safe.